He becomes a guilt offering for his people. He's rejected by his people. He's spurned. He's considered someone who is persona non grata.
Someone who's put to death.
And then he dies for the sin of his people to whom the stroke was due.
It's interesting in that passage, it's not just that he dies, but it says that one day he'll see the light, or perhaps the light of life.
Mm-hmm. After death.
After death. And so it's not just that he dies for the sins of the people, but he'll have an exalted resurrection, a glorious resurrection.
I find it fascinating that by the time you get to the times of Jesus, and let's say Jewish thought right before the time of Jesus, that there's expectation of a Messiah who's going to be a king, ruler. There's expectation of a high priest who's going to come.
That's the Dead Sea Scroll community too.
So you have this reference in some other writings as well, pointing to this high priest and then to this prophet, a prophet like Moses. So you've got these three different figures who all seem to be very important, and it's actually all the same one, just different aspects of his work. And I really wondered about this. I wrestled with this and thought about it because I dialogued with my fellow Jewish rabbis for years, and wanted to understand where they're coming from. And they'd always challenge me, okay, you've got like Isaiah 53. That's the passage I opened up to with my dad that he read.
Right.
He got red in the face because it looked like Jesus. But the rabbis would say, fine, it talks about suffering and death. That's Israel. That's what we experience as a nation. That's got nothing to do with the Messiah. So I really asked myself the question, on what basis do these suffering passages tie in with the concept of Messiah? And then it hit me, wait a second, David's the prototype. David's the one from whom these other concepts flow. And David was a king, but he also did priestly things. I mean, he did things nobody else could do as a king. He offers sacrifices, for example, at the end of 2 Samuel. He does other things that only the priests would do. There's even a passage in the Psalms that speaks of David or the Messiah as a priest. So I began to think, what do priests do? Priests deal with sin. Priests deal with issues of sacrifice. So Isaiah 53
and worship.
Yeah, is a priestly chapter dealing with sin. The Messiah's got to get in our world. And you think of it, we as Jewish people, do we just need this king who comes on the throne, sits royally and rules and reigns riding on a white horse? Or do we need someone that suffers like we suffered through history and is hated and rejected and despised? So he comes into our world as the ultimate preeminent Jew and suffers and takes our sin on his shoulder, does what the priests would do. And it's fascinating that within the Tanakh, within the Hebrew scriptures, in the writings of the prophets, this very theme comes up. And in Zechariah, the 6th chapter, he is identified, the Messiah is specifically identified with a high priest named Yehoshua, but most of the time he's called Yeshua. Interestingly, in our Hebrew Bible.
And that's worth just mentioning for a second, because the word Jesus, the Greek word, comes from Hebrew Yeshua, and there was a Yehoshua, that was the original name that got kind of contracted or
it's like
shortened.
Michael and Mike.
That's right.
Yeah. And it was a very common name in his day. And of course, Christ is the Greek way of saying
Messiah.
So Jesus Christ was not a reverend, right?
It wasn't a family name.
Right, exactly. He was not the son of
office.
Mr. and Mrs. Christ.
Right.
He was Yeshua called Messiah because he was that anointed one they were looking for. So in Zechariah 6, it says that this man called the branch, which was already a messianic title that we see in the
Which
Hebrew
also
scripture.
means a Davidic title.
Yes, exactly. So this one, the branch, is typified in a high priest. No. It's a king. It's a king who's a priest. What happens in Zechariah 6 is that the priest sits on a throne wearing a crown.
Crowns.
Yes.
So it's a stretch for people to hear that at that time, wasn't it?
Total.
That the Messiah would be both a priest and a king.
So as a priest, he comes and deals with our sins and suffers on our behalf. And as a king, he rules and reigns. It's not two different people or two different messiahs, the Messiah son of Joseph, the Messiah son of David. It's one and the same.
So as we're trying to follow this and keep our eyes on the seed, we're all of a sudden seeing that this figure, this promised one, is from David. He's a descendant of David. He's part of the dynasty. He's got a kingship which will be over the entire world. He's going to rule over the nations. But now he is also a priest who brings a sacrifice to God and who suffers for the sins of his people as an innocent atoning sacrifice.
The prophet Micah, around the same time as Isaiah, says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, you're little among the tribes of Judah, but from you will come forth one who's to be the ruler over all Israel."
You know, as we're sitting in the synagogue here in Susia, we're not a stone's throw, but we're probably about an 8 to 10 minute drive from where that city was mentioned, a little town called Bethlehem.
Yeah. And so he's going to come. The ruler over all Israel will come from Bethlehem. It's not talking about David, because David has already come. It's talking about a future king. He'll come from Bethlehem. And then it says, but his goings forth, his appearances are from old, even from everlasting. That it may say that, historically he will come from Bethlehem, temporally. But his real origin is from eternity past.
From the days of eternity, it says in Hebrew.
So it's really kind of amazing that this king who's going to come is the eternal one who's going to come to earth.
So here's the question. If this is really laid out in our Bible, right? But the great majority of Jews don't believe it. Say most American Jews, secular, they're not even studying this, looking at this. The ones who are studying it, they're not even considering Jesus. What's going to happen? What do the prophets tell us, like Zechariah 12? What's going to actually happen when our people, our Jewish people, especially the religious ones, recognize that this one that they thought was for the Goyim, for the Gentiles, or the head of the Catholic Church, or the Crusades, or just trying to kill us, or whatever the negative images they may have, that he's actually one of us and actually our Messiah.
Zechariah 12 is really remarkable because it talks about there will be a day at the end of days when the nations will come against Jerusalem, and it will be a bad time for Israel. And at
14, yeah.
Zechariah 14. Zechariah 12 also talks about the nations coming.
Right.
And this has never happened yet. I mean, what's spoken of there, to this day, still hasn't happened.
And at one point, Israel will finally turn and call for Messiah to help them. And Messiah, Yeshua, will return for his people and will recognize him. We'll see he's the pierced one.
He's the pierced one.
And then we're going to mourn and lament and weep. Why? For all the years of rejection. And it's going to be the morning of repentance. And at that point, he will deliver his people. And it is an amazing picture how they will turn. Our people, our very people, will turn to Messiah according to the prophets.
I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and they will weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. Zechariah chapter 12.
The one that we thought was the cause of our pain and suffering through so much of history, and that they associate Holocaust with Christianity somehow. The one that we thought was the author of our sufferings is actually the author of our salvation. And that's the light that goes on in Isaiah 53. We thought he was dying for his own sin, or that generation, we thought he was dying for his own sin, but he was actually dying for us. And that's why after the mourning and the repentance of Zechariah 12, it leads to Zechariah 13:1. And that day, there's going to be a fountain open for the cleansing of the Jewish people.
When you think about it, Mike, you've got two things which, in a sense, never should have happened. You got a people who was supposed to give birth to the Messiah, not recognizing him and rejecting him. And you've got the King of the Jews, who is accepted all over the world, but not by his own people.
Yeah, I think it's a tragedy, and yet there's a promise. The promise is that our people have been like sheep scattered about. And the prophet Ezekiel promises one day the shepherd of Israel will come, the true shepherd, the true king, and gather them back to him. And so while we often look and say, oh, he was the rejected one day he'll be the accepted one. He won't be the one that caused our problems as we thought. He'll be the deliverer, the shepherd of Israel.
Yeah, as I was challenged first by my dad, show me this in the Bible. And then he brings me to talk to the rabbi, and that rabbi to other rabbis. I took the challenge seriously. And then all my studies, I never went to Bible college or seminary, I studied all with secular professors, some here and there religious Jews, other Jews that weren't religious, but that always challenged my interpretation. So I studied and dug and looked at things. And the more I studied, the more clear it became to me that Jesus was the prophesied Messiah. I mean, I knew it in my own life because I was transformed. And now it's years and years going by, I was still transformed. And I had been brought from a place of no interest in God and wanting to live my own life to now really knowing him in a personal and wonderful way as Father, as Abba, and it was all through Jesus. And the thing that was so amazing to me was the great discovery that all those passages that the rabbis and the counter-missionaries told me, they don't talk about Jesus, the Messiah doesn't have to suffer. I realized, no, he's a priestly king. And as a priest, for every one of us, his blood takes away our sins.
Amen.
People are longing for an answer. They know the world's messed up. A lot of our lives have problems that are messed up, and we know there must be more. And we're looking for someone who's going to come and solve the world's problems or bring us peace or heal the wounds that we carry on the inside. And ultimately, that one is the one we call the Messiah, God's special one sent into the world, Jesus.
It doesn't just happen. You go out day after day, week after week, month after month. Discipline is necessary for physical and spiritual growth. Sometimes it feels great. Other times, it hurts. But you keep at it. It takes time. And you make it a priority. It might not be easy, but it's worth it. Our Daily Bread can help you connect with God daily. Visit odb.org/fitness to learn more.
From small town America to the big city, from sea to shining sea, we are united by our love for this flag and our love for the people and the land of Israel. We are Israel TV Network. From Texas to Israel and everywhere in between, we bridge the gap around the world and connect them all to the land where our faith was first born. We are Texans for Israel. Your tax-deductible donation to Texans for Israel makes production possible from movies, television programming, music, special events, and much more. We provide a global platform for individuals.
Hi, welcome back. I decided to sit for a while because I was getting kind of tired. I hope you don't mind. Now we're going to talk about Hezekiah again. The thing with Hezekiah was he was one of Israel's very best kings. Judah. I need to get that straight. It's Judah. And I want to clarify again. Here we have the northern tribes, the 10 tribes that have gone north, and that's called Israel. And we have the 2 southern tribes, which are Judah and Benjamin. So hopefully I can say this correctly because I'm so used to just saying the word Israel. But Hezekiah was king of Judah, of Benjamin and Judah. And there had been all this stuff that was going on with Assyria and the various kings. Now, Hezekiah was making an alliance with Syria, but it was a temporary alliance. And it was one that he was making out of the need to buy time. And the reason he needed to buy time was so that he could reinforce the walled city of Jerusalem. He needed to, as we were talking last time, he needed to secure the water supply. He needed to reinforce the walls. He needed to make sure that the inhabitants, the citizens of Jerusalem were protected. And so he had made this alliance with Sennacherib that he would buy friendship. Now, you know how it is. A friendship purchased is never a good friendship. And so Sennacherib sends his henchman in, and his henchman is Rabshakeh, who is probably, he speaks the Hebrew language. Now, our Bibles call it Judean, but it's Hebrew. And because he speaks it fluently, it gives us a real good indication that possibly he was a Jew who had been captured or possibly converted to whatever the Assyrian language, language and culture and spiritual background was at the time. Anyhow, he was the one chosen by Sennacherib to come and to tout the plea to Hezekiah to taunt the people. And so this is where we pick up with this story now. His whole point is to terrify the citizenry of Jerusalem. Now, Sennacherib made some demands. The first demand he made was that, through his emissary, because he wasn't there, remember, he's off at war somewhere else. So he through Rabshakeh and his cohorts, they demand 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Well, that's a lot of money. Hezekiah emptied the royal treasury as well as the temple treasury. He even removed the gold overlay from the temple doors, which he had installed to replace already missing gold. Now, if you remember, during the time of his father, King Ahaz, he had stripped the treasury then, and he had stripped it of the gold and everything else. And so Hezekiah, in his desire to rebuild the temple, not to physically rebuild the building, but to clean it up and to make sure everything was proper, he had put a new gold overlay on the temple doors. And now he needed that gold. He needed every dime of silver and gold he could get his hands on to pay this ransom, if you will, to Sennacherib via his henchman, Rabshakeh. So Rabshakeh, whose name means chief cupbearer and is probably a former Judean, has been captured or surrendered. At any rate, he spoke what I already said. He spoke Judean, which is Hebrew. So in Isaiah 37, verses 16 through 18, we see where he rides up to the walls of Jerusalem, which are extremely well fortified now, and he starts calling to the people in Hebrew, mocking Hezekiah and telling them that he has left them without protection from their God since he tore down the high places. Now, what Rabshakeh is saying here is because Hezekiah took down all these altars where people went and they worshipped and made sacrifices to these idols. So Rabshakeh is saying that Hezekiah has left them vulnerable. He's not giving any credence at all to this one true God of Israel. He's not giving any credence at all to the possibility that this one true God of Israel would provide the rescue and the resources that they needed. He's just saying, hey, Chuck, you guys are without protection because you tore down the idols. Why does anybody worship an idol anyway? I mean, you just figured out you make this little device here. This is a replica of some of the pottery that they've found in Israel. And you make this little device with your hands. I mean, you get the clay, you get it wet, you form it like this, you let it dry, you bake it so that's hard, and then you put it on a shelf and worship it? Good grief. But we do that, don't we? We worship at our TV stations. We worship at our iPads, our computers. Oh my gosh, our computers are great places of worship. We worship our cars, our homes, our yards, mowing the yard on Sunday or on Shabbat. We do things that we don't really have the right to sit in judgment. We just need to think about, is this something that we do? So Rabshakeh referred to King Hezekiah as Hezekiah, refusing to honor his title but calls Sennacherib the great king. And Rabshakeh says it's God's will that Sennacherib overthrow Judah. Don't you just love it? When somebody says, well, it's God's will. Well, I think, well, who died to appointed you God to begin with? You know, that kind of stuff just irritates me. Somebody said the other day that a particular person, if they voted for a particular person, there was a hot place in hell for them. I think, well, who made you the judge and jury and all that stuff? So anyhow, Eliakim is one of Hezekiah's trusted servants. And Eliakim, appeals to Rabshakeh to speak in Aramaic, which is the language that he understood. Eliakim was an educated man. He spoke Hebrew. He spoke Aramaic. And he's saying to Rabshakeh, hey, speak to us in Aramaic. We understand that. And Rabshakeh says, get over yourself. It's these little guys that I'm speaking to up here. It's them I want their attention, because as soon as they figure out what's going on, you're toast. Well, he wants them to surrender in fear. And then Rabshakeh tells the people that they need to surrender for their own good. If it will go easier on them if they surrender without a fight, Assyrians move. He says they'll live in peace and prosperity elsewhere. Well, as I said previously on the earlier lesson, it was the ideology or the thought process of the Assyrians to pluck up the people that they defeated and move them over here to another land, to Assyria or somewhere else. Because when you do that, you uproot them and you take away their loyalty to that land. We haven't seen that in the last few years, have we? As we've seen aliens come in from other parts of the country or world, we see them come in and demand that they have their customs along with them. Yeah, I know I'm interfering. Rabshakeh makes his claims and answers even louder so the people can hear and be in fear. He issues then an insult, absolute insult to Hezekiah. He says, hey, Hezi, we're ready to give you 2,000 horses here if you've got enough men to put on them. So he's saying to Hezekiah, we're huge. We're so huge that we can give up 2,000 horses, and you're so small that you can't even put 2,000 men on them. So I don't have to give them up, because that's part of the problem there. I mean, it's an insult. It's an in-your-face dare. And Rabshakeh tells the Jews to surrender again. He just keeps saying that to them. And then he accused Hezekiah of feigning friendship with Sennacherib in order to buy time to mobilize for battle. Well, part of that's true. Hezekiah did feign a friendship or buy a temporary friendship with Sennacherib in order to give him time to reinforce the city and to get the water where it was safe and to reinforce the walls of the city. Hezekiah warned his enemies to keep quiet, not to respond to any, or his emissaries to keep quiet, not to respond to anything Rabshakeh said. Now, the reason for that was if they responded to Rabshakeh, to his dare, his taunting, if they responded to him in any way, then they could take that. And I know it's going to be a little hard for you to understand this today with nobody taking anything out of context, but if they responded to him, he could take whatever they said and twist it and dissect it and use it as a threat. And then that would give the Assyrian army the legal right to attack Judah. Can you imagine that? I mean, where's the détente? Where's all this peaceful stuff we hear about today? And so Hezekiah's emissaries were quiet. They said nothing, other than when Eliakim asked Rabshakeh to please speak in Aramaic. Rabshakeh compared God to his idols and said that God, the one true God, the Jewish God, wasn't capable of standing up to Sennacherib. Well, that's a slap in the face. And Hezekiah's emissaries were so grieved over the ugly words of Rabshakeh that they literally tore their garments over the blasphemy. And then when you tear your garment over a blasphemy, you're not allowed to repair it. So as long as you have that garment, you walk around with it torn. It's a sign of grief. It's a sign of just total disruption in the life of the one who's been insulted like that. And Rabshakeh tells the people that they shouldn't rely on Egypt to come to the rescue because Egypt's military, and there's nothing left, nothing. And it says they are so thin that if you leaned on them now, like you would lean on a reed, you would get a splintering. Warring is against Egypt. Well, the thing is, that wasn't true at all. But the people didn't know it. I mean, there's no Channel 9 news flying over the war saying, oh, well, this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening. They just didn't know it. And so he could make these false accusations, and the people were fearful. You would be, I would be. Rabshakeh repeats that it would be futile to oppose him because the gods of the other nations didn't defend them.